All right, so as I talked about in the introduction, your images are all in Lightroom here, and then I've separated them. Your images that were labeled image one are set up here first. Those are your soft light images, and then your image number two is your hard light image, and I've kept the contact sheet with your hard light image. Now, this is another example of how you need to be reading those directions really carefully, because if you submitted your hard light image as image number one, that indicates to me that you didn't understand the difference between the light, because the first image is supposed to be soft light. So it's really key that you understand the different types of light and that you communicate that to me by properly naming your images. So first we'll look at all of these soft light images. And we're starting off with a really strong example here by Kayla. And so we're in Lightroom. They're in the grid setup right now. And to see an individual image, I'm going to hit E for the loop view. So that's what we have here, seeing this image full screen. She's at ISO 200, 35 millimeters of 6.3 at 1/40th of a second. Now, an adjustment I might make here on those settings would be to shoot with a little bit wider of an aperture, let in more light with the aperture, and then have a slightly faster shutter speed. Just because you're dealing with a younger girl here, and it's very possible that she's not going to hold still for 1/40th of a second. So it would just be, it doesn't even have to be a full stop. It could just be a third of a stop to f5.6, and then you'd shoot this at 1/60th of a second. The exposure, the amount of light hitting the image sensor, looks good here. If we bring this into the develop module, we can see that there's very little, you just see right here on the shirt, that's getting blown out and having no detail. So she held on to all of the highlights like we want to see here. So the exposure, the amount of light hitting the image sensor, looks good. The light that she's using is soft light, and this is a great example of what we're looking for with soft light. So we have the light on the right side of the image, the windows on the right side, and then it comes across and it slowly falls off. And this side is definitely in shadow. But it's not so much in shadow that we can't see any detail here. That fall off, that gradient between the brighter areas and the darker areas is very large, right? It's a smooth, wide gradient happening. So this is a great example of soft light. You can see as we're looking at the shadow under her chin, as we're looking at the shadow of her nose, that the shadows that are being created are softer. They don't have a hard line to them. So this is all indicating that this is soft light. You've also moved your subject, it looks like, very close to the window. And depending on the time of day, to get the effects of window light, you might have to be 6 inches from the window because the sun's just not that bright. The light coming in is just not that bright. And that might have been the situation here, and that worked out really well. That was a really smart choice to get very close to the window, then exclude the window from your framing so you don't have any blown out areas, but that you got that beautiful light on your subject. Nice job on this, Kayla. This is another great example. This image is by Nakia, and we're at ISO 400, 50 millimeters, so a normal lens, f1.8 at 1/125th of a second. So all of those settings look good. That f1.8 allows for a really shallow depth of field. Shallow enough that the edge of the glasses are in focus, but by the time we move to this eye, it falls out of focus. The back of his hair falls out of focus. The back of his neck falls out of focus. Everything in the background that looks like it could be pretty distracting isn't really distracting, because that's not where our eye is going, because it's out of focus. So that was a really smart aperture choice for this image. Shutter speed is nice and fast at 1/125th, so you can make sure that your subject is still. The amount of light hitting the image sensor looks good. If we come to the develop module and look at what's getting blown out, you just have those specular highlights on the glasses, and that's totally acceptable in an image like this. We would rather see those get overexposed than to misrepresent the color of his, or the tonal value of his skin. The light here again is very clearly soft light. We can see the window in the glasses in front of your subject, and we see that light being bright on his cheek and then slowly falling off to shadow areas. We can see he also is a little bit backlit by a light or a window that's in the background that's opening up this part of the area, so giving highlights on the back side of the neck and side of the face. And you can see here the shadow along the neck is that soft light that we're looking for. It's a nice smooth gradient. There's not a hard line that we'll see in the hard light images. Nice job with this image, nice focus. It's hard to get the focus right on when we're shooting with wide open apertures like that. If you could, I would move your subject just slightly to get that reflection off his eye. I don't mind it on the glasses, but as it's intruding with our vision of his eye, it becomes a little bit of a distraction. Looking at your contact sheet, it looks like you might have some images where that's not happening, where that light's not coming right on his eye, but here you have soft light, and now it's not as wide of an aperture, or it is as wide of an aperture, but maybe he's closer to what's in the background. So it's sharper, but now it's kind of telling a story as open presence, it looks like in the background. Okay, another great example here of soft light. Here we're looking at Brad's image. Let's see, you're at, so this is something for you guys to notice. See how underneath the histogram, if I'm over here, it's giving different numbers. That's the tonal value of the red, green, and blue, the percentage of each of those in the image. So if you're looking at your images in Lightroom and your cursor is over the image, you're going to get those numbers. And if you move it off, you're going to be able to get your aperture shutter speed ISO. That's only in the develop module, but that's important for you to know. All right. So the exposure is ISO 100, nice and low, 29 millimeters wide angle, f3.5, shallow depth of field at 1/50th of a second. So 1/50th of a second is a slower shutter speed, but remember we always want our shutter speed to be faster than our focal length, and he was able to hold on to that here with this image. We are at 1/50th of a second at 29 millimeters. So that allows everything to be nice and sharp. No camera shake if he wasn't on a tripod. So the exposure on your subject is good. We might have some areas in the window that are getting blown out, and that's fine because what we really want to have nice exposure on is this girl's face, and that has beautiful light, perfect exposure on it. The composition here, you have the window in the foreground, you have your subject nice and close to the window, the curtains are creating that diffused light, but there's some space behind her that's not being used, and it becomes a bit of a distraction, especially because there's this bright area here. So if I were creating this image, I would, instead of shooting it as a horizontal shot, I would shoot it as a vertical shot. So we would just come in as you're photographing it, not in post-production, to something like this, where you can avoid those distractions in the background, have a little bit more space in front of her than you do behind her. That might take an angle, a different angle, but something like this is a lot cleaner, allows us just to look at the subjects instead of here where we have that distracting element in the background. This is all fine, it's not really distracting, but you might as well get a little bit closer and take it as a vertical shot to avoid this area here. Make sure as you're photographing, if you're using negative space as you are here, that you're always using it to further the intent of the image. All right, this image is by Tiffany. We're at ISO 100, 60 millimeters, a little bit longer than a normal lens, f5 at 1/6 of a second. So at 1/6 of a second, for this image to be sharp, you're going to have to be on a tripod. And it looks like she was on the tripod. We can look at the shirt here and see like the dust or fuzz or whatever that's on the shirt. We can see great detail there. So we know that this was set up on a tripod in order to get all of that still. The exposure looks good. If we come up here, we can see that the Fort Night gets a little bit blown out. But again, I'm not concerned about that because we want the main part of the image, his face, to be have the best exposure. And that's what you chose there. You don't have any blocked up highlight or shadows. The focus seems to be a little bit more on his shirt than on his eyes. So you just focus a little bit behind him. So as you're focusing, just work on that. getting the eyes totally sharp in the image. You can see how his lips fall out of focus because those are even closer to the camera lens, but the wall is in focus. So you focused a little bit further behind him than you needed to for this image. The light on the image is definitely soft light. Again, that smooth gradient from the highlight area. You come all the way across and there's no point where you think, oh, now we're in the shadow. It just smoothly happens, and that's what we're going to get with soft light. You don't see a shadow of his nose very clearly. It's just kind of this darker area right in here. The cheek isn't a strong line. As we look at his neck, you can see the light is brighter and then it falls off into darkness, but there's no hard shadows there. Even if you look at the shadow on the wall of his head, that's all nice, soft, diffused shadows. You're not having any hard shadows there. So that's looking great. This image, I think, is a little bit static, having him centered within the frame and having him just up against the wall with some texture on it. So moving him into more of an environment that could tell more of a story about him would be your next step here. So you've got great light here, you have good exposure, but your next step as you're looking at images is going to be creating that narrative with your images. Let's look at one more, and this is another image that has a nice soft light for us. This image is by Megan. See, she's at ISO 100, kept that nice and low. Are 27 millimeters, which is a really wide angle. And just as a general rule, we want to be shooting with longer lenses as we're doing portraits and wider lenses more for landscapes. And you can argue both sides of this, that the opposite is true. But in general, we want longer lenses for portraits because it compresses the features. It makes like your forehead doesn't look like it's way far back and your nose way forward. It doesn't exaggerate those features, it kind of compresses them. Because you're further away from your subject, we're not having that effect here. That's not a problem. I just wanted to mention that. You're at f4, so shallower depth of field, at 1/10 of a second. So that 1/10 of a second, I think, could work perfectly fine here, but it looks like your subject moves. As we get closer to the image, or to the subject, and we try to focus in on her eyes, we can see that it's not quite sharp. But as we look at her body, I think she was still. I think she just shifted her head a little bit as you were photographing. And that's the problem with this, like 1/10 of a second. Anything slower than really 1/40th of a second is going to have the opportunity for adults to be moving still. Even at like 1/100th of a second, you might have kids still moving because they're just not going to be as still. But here you can see there's a little bit of movement, even though it looks like she's very focused on being still in this image. So what I would recommend here is to open up your aperture. You might get a half a stop more exposure there, or a third of a stop more exposure with your aperture if you're able to open that a little bit wider. And then you're just going to have to bite the bullet on this and set your ISO a little bit higher than you want to, because it's most important that the image is still before like we choose to have a nice sharp image, and then we choose to bring down the ISO, right? That's the kind of the order that you want to do that. Also, maybe just having her sit down, she'd be more calm, and that would allow this to be nice and sharp. But the light that you're using is a great example of soft light. We can see that catch light in her eyes of the window, which is beautifully done. And then the light comes across her face, highlighting the far side of her face the most, and then slowly falling off. Again, there's no hard shadows happening here. We don't see any shadow from her hair on her, like or behind her. We don't have any issues with the hard shadow. You could argue that right here, as you're looking at that light coming off the necklace, that you're seeing a hard shadow from that, but that's just because it's so close to the skin. If we look in the background, her shadow is just like, it moves everywhere, right? It's not a defined line there. So this is a good example of soft light. I'd work on that shutter speed and probably get a little bit closer to your subject so you're not surrounding her and centering her with a lot of negative space around her.